Idaho Matters podcast is brought to you by St. Luke's On-Demand Virtual Care, which allows patients to see a provider from their home using a computer or smartphone with on-demand care for common ailments such as a cough, sore throat, or a sinus issue. More information at stlukesonline.org. Idaho Matters is taking a deep dive into the loss of farmland here in the Gem State. Are you a farmer? What challenges do you face as farmland shrinks in Idaho? We want to hear your story. Email us at idahomatters@boisestate.edu or leave us a voicemail using the Talk to Us feature in the Boise State Public Radio app. And then listen to our series on farming called Land and Legacy. Episodes available on Monday afternoons in the Idaho Matters podcast feed. More Idaho Matters now from the studios of Boise State Public Radio News. I'm Gemma Gaudet. And just a quick note that the following segment deals with sexual assault and sexual abuse. Here's the headline. Sex abuse in Idaho women's prisons has gone largely unchecked. That is just one of the headlines from a series of stunning reports from Investigate West. They're tracking a long list of sexual abuse incidents by guards and women inmates. Whitney Bryan is an Idaho-based reporter for Investigate West who focuses on injustice and vulnerable populations, and she is part of the team reporting on the 6-part series. And she sat down with our Morning Edition host, George Prentice, for a preview of their new series. So let's take a listen.
First off, I have to ask, and I'm pretty sure I know what the answer to this is, can I assume that the abuse of a guard upon a woman inside prison walls has not been an isolated case? Give me a sense of, do you have an idea of how many cases we're talking about?
Well, that's a great question. First of all, no, we found it is not an isolated case. We found cases of this happening across all 3 facilities in Idaho that incarcerate women. We also found multiple cases at each of those facilities. The problem is we can give numbers for what we have found in our reporting, documented allegations, the number of victims that we've spoken to who told us about their experiences, but we know that those are underreported. And we know that because many of the women we spoke to said this is the first time they've ever spoken about that abuse. Sexual abuse is already, I think, as most of your listeners probably know, very underreported in general. And you can imagine why women who are incarcerated, who are under the control of their abusers, would be even more, dissuaded from reporting that abuse. So what we do know is we've seen 37 prison workers accused of abuse in the last decade. Those are situations that we have interviewed women about or seen documented reports of.
37, can I also assume with very different outcomes?
Absolutely. So of the 37 that we've identified, we know that 18 of those guards, mostly men, they resigned shortly after the alleged abuse happened or right after it was reported. 8 of those men were fired, and 3 of them were criminally charged with a felony in the state of Idaho.
I have to ask, to the best of your knowledge, are any of them still employed by the Department of Correction?
Of the 37 that we have found, yes, there are a couple of people who were accused of this kind of abuse who do still work for the department, as far as we know.
So how did all of this start for you and your colleagues? Was it a tip? Was it a letter, a phone call? How did all of this start?
We got a tip, as the greatest stories in journalism tend to start. Someone reached out to us, someone who was actually advocating for one of these victims who was accusing a guard, multiple guards actually, of assaulting her while she was behind bars, reached out and said, this woman has been sharing her stories with us. We think, we believe her. We think this is a bigger problem than just this one woman's experience. and she's willing to talk to you about it. So it really all started with a tip from this woman's advocate, and we quickly connected with the woman herself. She was at that time she was behind bars at a jail. She had been arrested for a new charge and was reporting instances of abuse that occurred years earlier while she was incarcerated in prison.
When you get to a number like this, a number of incidents, and the reoccurrence for years, it's fair to say that it's a probable crisis or a culture problem to which the Department of Correction says what?
Well, the Department of Correction would deny that. They have said to us, we do not believe that we have a culture problem. I spoke with the director of the Department of Correction, Bree Derrick. She actually took over that position earlier this year in April. She was the deputy director previous to that. And I explained our findings to her, and she said, we don't think we have a culture problem. And she laid out for me many of the policies that the Department of Correction has for just this type of situation. She admitted that they know that this kind of thing can happen in prison settings. It's going to happen in prison settings. And so there's policy and procedure to address what happens when it does occur, when it is reported. The problem, though, what we've found is those policies, they're not being followed, and there is no oversight in the facilities themselves to ensure that the policies are properly being followed. So, that they are arguing, no, it's not a culture problem, but are also admitting to us that there's not a procedure for overseeing the direct facilities where these instances are occurring and where they're not being properly investigated and dealt with.
To that end, you got no sense of any wholesale changes, just a reliance on existing policies and practices.
That's correct. There were no drastic or proposed changes to policy or oversight that I'm aware of. That was not discussed when I spoke with Director Derrick.
Were you surprised at all at anything the director had to say in that conversation?
I think that the biggest surprise for me in talking with the director, we spoke in person, and I believe that she was surprised to hear our findings.
Yeah.
She seemed to not be aware of how big this problem is in Idaho women's prisons. She, of course, again acknowledged that these sexual abuses do sometimes occur in prisons, and that's why there are both federal standards and state policies, department policies that need to be followed to ensure that when it does happen, it's properly responded to and guards are held accountable. But she seemed genuinely surprised to hear the number of um, abusive workers that are being accused by women who are currently or have recently been behind bars.
Absolutely, because I think the thing that hits me is the magnitude. And I have had access to just three of these reports, and you're going to be published, six reports in all. It is quite jaw-dropping. And whether the department chooses to do anything about it, I guess what's different this time is just the magnitude of this.
That's what struck us also, George. As I mentioned, we started this reporting with, one woman who explained her experience to us. That woman had multiple experiences with sexual abuse perpetrated against her by more than one guard during her time behind bars in Idaho prisons. And that woman knew of many others that she said, had expressed their experiences to her also. While she was in jail this summer, that's where I spoke to her. She filed an official complaint against these men who had abused her for the first time ever. Some of these complaints were against men who no longer work at the department, and who perpetrated abuse, nearly a decade ago. But she had reached her limit this summer, and she was now facing, another prison sentence where
Right.
she might be sent back into these facilities with some of these abusers. And so she felt inspired, motivated to report the abuse, and in hopes that it would be taken seriously and that she would be better protected this time. After she reported that from jail, she started telling other women that were there at the jail with her what she did. And she started hearing more and more cases, me too, that happened to me too. I had a similar experience. And so many people started coming forward, after she sort of lit this fire. And many of them agreed to speak to us about their experiences over time in women's prisons. So it certainly felt to me as a reporter, I'm thinking a lot about the Me Too movement, women's sexual abuse outside of prison walls. I think most of your audience has, read and heard about those instances, and that movement. That's a bit of what I was thinking about while interviewing these women. It certainly feels like a similar situation.
With your permission, I want to take a few minutes to dive into one of your case studies, and that involves Jamie Hamilton. She is identified as Jamie Hamilton, serving a sentence for repeat driving under the influence. Derek Stetler was indeed a guard. Quote, and this is from your reporting, quote, he would always tell me, you're not the type of person that should be in here, she says. It made her feel special, human, in a place with little humanity. Their bond grew more intense. He would pass her love notes. They would flirt. He would grope and kiss her in linen closets away from the cameras. And then there were an increasing number of, well, sexual events to which she said, what am I supposed to do? She asked her mom on the phone from prison. Am I supposed to yell? Am I supposed to fight him off? Am I supposed to put my time behind bars at risk? This was at the Pocatello prison. They began investigating in spring of 2022. The woman, Jamie Hamilton, was transferred to South Idaho Correctional Institution. Within months, prosecutors charged Stetler with rape. But then she was ostracized by other women who called her a rat after he got fired. He did take his own life a month later. We all remember that news story. But she, Jamie Hamilton, was blamed by staff at the prison. She says, I was called a murderer. I was called a black widow. And this is an important part of this report as well. And that is these women, these victims, being labeled as instigators.
Absolutely. That is something that we heard over and over again. Um, over the past 11 months or so that I've been working on this project, I've personally interviewed a couple of dozen women who spent time in Idaho prisons and who either had a personal experience being abused by a guard or a prison worker, or who witnessed, knew about other instances of that type of alleged abuse. And this came up in, I would say, most of those conversations. Women who did report something that happened to them were, as you said, ostracized by both other inmates as well as staff members who, blamed the victim in these cases for getting, their colleague, their coworker in trouble, for manipulating. That's a word we heard a lot, manipulating these men, these guards, into doing, sexual acts with them to so that the inmate can get what they want. Right.
Yeah.
That was often what we were told, that sort of the idea of other guards was the inmate must have wanted something and therefore, coaxed my coworker into doing these sexual acts with her so that she could exchange, sexual favors for contraband. For, in one case, a woman was given a cell phone in exchange for doing a sexual favor for a guard. Other women told us they got candy and sodas. They got sunglasses. One woman got a sweatshirt that she wasn't supposed to have, but these are all, high commodities inside of a prison where your living situation is very restricted, your communication with the outside very restricted, and so those are appealing offers to some of these women in the moment. And so they're often, made to be the criminal in these cases rather than the victim.
I'm thinking of a series of previous reports that did affect change. I'm thinking of investigative pieces that put daylight on inmates using prisoners as gladiators. I'm thinking of Idaho's continued intention of sending inmates out of state. I'm thinking of Idaho's use of dry cells within prison walls. Change has been affected by previous investigative pieces. I know that that's not your intent here, but it is about what? Putting daylight on this, right?
Absolutely. And I would say that while, our job is to provide as much information to the public as possible, we want the public to be able to understand as fully as possible what's happening inside these prisons, what we've found, and what these women are describing to us. We also want them to understand, the processes that are currently in place, what the department says it is and should be doing when these things are reported, so that the public can make a decision as to what needs to change, right?
Yeah.
Clearly, there's a problem here. I don't think that the Director Derrick at the Department of Correction would argue with that. She didn't argue with that when I spoke with her, but as to what needs to be done to, to change things for the better, I don't have the answer to that. I'm sure nobody has a single answer, but um, certainly steps that can be taken to, increase oversight in these facilities and ensure that at least existing policies are being followed.
That was our morning edition host, George Prentice, speaking with Whitney Bryan. She's an Idaho-based reporter for Investigate West, and she is part of the team reporting on their new 6-part series on sex abuse in Idaho's women's prisons. And that'll do it for this episode of Idaho Matters. Thanks so much for listening. And just a reminder, you can find all of our episodes wherever you get your podcasts.
Sources and methods, the crown jewels of the intelligence community. Shorthand for how do we know what's real? Who told us? If you have those answers, you're on the inside, and NPR wants to bring you there. From the Pentagon to the State Department to spy agencies, listen to understand what's really happening and what it means for you. Sources and Methods, the new national security podcast from NPR.